The year was 1733, and the world beyond Cremona buzzed with talk of kings and crowns. Far away in Poland, King Augustus II, the Strong, had died, leaving behind a throne without an heir. It seemed a distant affair to the people of this quiet Lombard city on the Po River, famous for its violins, its craftsmen, and its golden fields. Yet, even as the bells of the Cathedral of Cremona tolled across the piazza, whispers began. "The French are coming," someone murmured. "For Poland?" came the puzzled reply. "No," said another. "For us." In Poland, the nobles had gathered to elect a new king. Many favoured Stanislaw Leszczynski, once a Polish monarch himself, and now the father-in-law of King Louis XIV of France. The Polish monarchs were elected. But the Emperor Charles VI of Austria and Empress Anne of Russia refused to accept a French-backed candidate. They championed Augustus III, the son of the late king. Two kings were proclaimed, and here comes the war. For France and Spain, the Polish question was an excuse to strike at Austria's power. For Cremona, it was the beginning of another unwanted war. In a small shop near the Piazza del Comune, a violin maker, Giuseppe, bent over his workbench listening to the chatter outside, his mind going over the question. They say the emperor calls us his subjects, but now the French and the Spanish march this way. Whose subjects will we be next month? It's the same every war. We make violins, they make widows. Outside, Austrian soldiers marched through the square, their white coats bright against the grey stone. To the people of Cremona, they were both protectors and occupiers, foreign rulers who demanded loyalty, taxes, and silence. But our hero, well, he'd married the daughter of one. Perhaps he spoke a bit of German? She could at least make herself understood. By 1734, the storm had broken. French and Spanish troops, allied to defend Stanislaus' claim, poured across the Alps into northern Italy. The Austrians, already fighting on too many fronts, fell back towards Mantua and Parma. Soon the fertile fields between the Po and the Oglio rivers became the front lines of Europe's quarrel. The Battle of Parma thundered only a day's ride from Cremona. Cannons roared from the distant hills, and smoke rose like storm clouds. Weeks later came another clash, the Battle of Guastalla, so close that the ground in Cremona trembled underfoot. Well, I might be exaggerating. Refugees streamed through the city gates, fields lay trampled. Bread grew scarce. The sound of music was replaced by the crack of muskets. They fight for the Polish crown, people were saying in the market, but they break Italian hearts to do it. By 1735, Prince Charles Bourbon, a young and fiery commander from Spain, had taken the lead in the southern campaigns. His victories in Naples and Sicily filled Europe with his name. In Cremona, rumours spread that he would soon march north again. When Spanish troops entered the city that spring, they came weary but triumphant. The Austrians had retreated. The people watched from behind shuttered windows as new banners, red and gold, flooded over the citadel. "Is this victory, you think?" Caterina asked Giuseppe. "No," he replied, setting down his tools. "This is another kind of silence." For months, Cremona was caught between armies. Supplies were seized, workshops turned to barracks. Yet, amid the fear, acts of kindness glimmered, nuns tending the wounded, families sharing bread with strangers, children carrying water to soldiers on the streets. Even in war, Cremona refused to lose its soul. While the people of Lombardy suffered, Stanislaw Leszczynski, the man for whom this war had begun, was trapped in the city of Danzig, besieged by Russian and Saxon troops. He waited for French help that never truly came. The city fell and the would-be king escaped in disguise, wandering through forests until he found refuge in Prussia. When the news reached Cremona, Katharina sighed. All this, our fields, our hunger for a king who has no crown. Guarneri nodded. That is the music of Europe, my dear. The tune is always played far away, but we dance to it here. At last, in 1738, weary diplomats signed the Treaty of Vienna. The war that had begun for Poland's throne finally ended. The peace settled like dust after a storm. Augustus III was confirmed as King of Poland. Stanislaw Leszczynski, the exile, received Lorraine in France as his consolation prize. Nancy, the city where he set up his capital, is very close to Mirecourt in the Vosges, and this Duchy of Lorraine, after his death, would go to the King of France. So if you ever want to go visit the French heart of violin making in Mirecourt, you can pop up to Nancy and see the Place Stanislas. Now, France would inherit Lorraine after his death, and Spain gained Naples and Sicily for the young Charles of Bourbon. Austria, though weakened, reclaimed Lombardy and Cremona. When Austrian banners returned, the people no longer cheered or cursed. They simply watched, tired of change. Although for Giuseppe, he was still making through this time, and soldiers, they were still clients. And when all these soldiers left, that meant clients had gone, but it also meant real estate was opening up for he and his wife. And he wasn't going to complain about peace. So we're back in Cremona. It's the early 1730s, and our young Giuseppe Guarneri Del Gesu has returned home. He's back working alongside his father, something he probably would have preferred not to do, but well then, here we are. And after years of drifting, trying his luck elsewhere, maybe even working in another workshop, he's back where it all began. Only now things are different. The instruments he's making don't quite look like his father's anymore. And there's a new feel, a new confidence, as if Del Gesu is finally starting to find his own voice. His father, Giuseppe Filius Andrea, is older now, unwell, carving scrolls in the corner while his son finishes off the instruments he can't complete. Together they're producing the last of the Filius Andrea violins. But it is clear the torch is being passed. And as this is going on, Cremona itself is in chaos. The War of the Polish Succession has spilled into Italy. Soldiers are marching through the streets. Taxes have tripled. It's a lot. But in the middle of all that noise, in this small dusty workshop, Del Gesu is quietly reinventing himself. This is where the story really starts to shift, where Del Gesu begins to step out of his father's shadow and into his own skin. Now we come back to the young Del Gesu, and he is back working with his father. Some people think that in the years he was not with his father, he may have continued to make instruments, finding employment in another workshop outside of Cremona. One of his earliest surviving instruments with an original label, the Baltic of 1731, shows many stylistic differences to the instruments made by his father. It has also been suggested that many of his working techniques from 1731 were also different from those he would have been taught in his youth. Where was he to be influenced in such a way? But first things first, he would begin by finishing off the instruments hanging around that his father had started but hadn't the energy to finish. He glued the Filius Andrea labels into these last violins and cellos. These would be Giuseppe Filius Andrea's last instruments. The last of the original Filius Andrea labels that we know of are from the year 1731. And well, this kind of makes sense, as these would have been the last instruments he was able to make or started making, and his son Del Gesu finished for him. And it is also these instruments that you hear of becoming Del Gesu sometimes, that they were originally identified as Filius Andreas. They were actually often collaborations. It was a cool autumn morning, and Del Gesu was on his way to the printer to have a new set of labels printed out for himself. These were different to anything the family had done so far. He was not going to mention St. Teresa on his labels like his father, grandfather, and sometimes uncle had done. He had never done this, so he was not going to do it now. He was going to make this clear and simple. His new label design simply had his name, Giuseppe Guarneri, where it was made, Fecit Cremona, and when it was made, anno 1731, for example. Next to it was the sign IHS. Was there a sign IHS on his new workshop building to let people know where to find him? Was this a distinct marker to set him apart from his father? Was it superstition? Or a bit of all three? Who knows? But what we do know is that this new label with the IHS symbol and cross would many years later earn him his most famous nickname, that of Del Gesu. IHS is an ancient Christian symbol representing the first three letters in Greek of Jesus' name. In Latin, it was used as an abbreviation of Iesus Dominum Salvator, Jesus, Saviour of man. It was also a symbol used by a great many religious orders, lay companies and societies, as a symbol of Christ, hence the name Del Gesu. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, the symbol could just as easily have been an address or a way to find the workshop. His father's instruments were under the sign of St. Teresa. The Venetian maker Domenico Montagnana signed his instruments at the sign of Cremona, sub signem Cremonae. Over in Milan, you could find most instrument makers in the Via Larga, and they all had their own distinctive shop sign. Grancino was at the sign of the Crown. Landolfi worked at the sign of the Siren. And Carlo Giuseppe Testori was at the sign of the dog howling at the moon. This move and new label really marks a golden period in Del Gesu's instrument making. We see influences coming from Stradivari and a fluid, affirming style. He has strong thicknesses of wood, low, stiff archings, and quite large, open-cut sound holes. Through the markings and pins he uses, we see that he is not experimenting with different construction techniques, but rather sticking to the traditional method taught to him by his father. We find the trusty central back pin on his instruments that Stradivari does not use, for example. But what, you ask, is happening with the older Giuseppe? Well, he is in his 60s, and after coming home from the bacterial swamp that was 18th century hospitals of his day, he was in no fit state to make a complete instrument, but he could still prove himself useful. He had always been a proficient scroll carver, and now, in his weakened state, that is what he would continue to do. At his own workbench in the corner, I like to imagine, he would continue to help his son by carving scroll after scroll. Goodness knew, his son, left to his own devices, would never have the same movement in his carvings as he did. So, for now, Del Gesu's instruments would predominantly be the work of both father and son. The year is 1733, and young Giuseppe Del Gesu is witnessing a document for the local priest. But all anyone can talk about is the war, and how on earth are they going to pay these new taxes that had tripled in their amount almost overnight? They were struggling to buy bread, let alone pay more taxes. It was the War of the Polish Succession, and once again, Cremona was finding herself in the middle of continued conflict. Seriously, Poland was nowhere near Cremona or Lombardy, but the French and the Austrians were fighting over the control of Milan. I mean, any excuse really, and they were at it again. The French had decided that Cremona was just the place to set up camp and house their enormous number of soldiers. Let's see how this pans out, shall we? In the autumn of 1733, the War of the Polish Succession spilled over into Italy, and Cremona was once again in the centre of action. Well, gotta say it was the French again. They just turned up unexpectedly and took over Cremona relatively quickly, I might add. Well, it was the French and the Piedmontese. And so for the next 3 years, there were troops and soldiers coming in and out of the city, creating a stressful atmosphere all round. The citizens were once again faced with an uncertain future and smothered by hundreds of troops inundating the city, stretching its resources. Carlo Emanuel III, he was the guy occupying the city, the Duke of Savoy, he was really concentrating on winning his war, and as the French would say, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. And right at this moment, his priority was looking after his army, so he lost little time in raising the taxes of the Cremonese, requesting food and finding lodgings for his boys. It seemed like Cremona was the egg to be cracked for this particular omelette. Here's Julian Thompson playing on his Guarneri cello that Del Gesu finished for his father after he fell ill. Joe Bein talking about Del Gesu's instruments of the 1730s after his father falls ill and he returns to help out.
Right, and that's just, I mean, and I think it was Dwayne and Carlo who discovered that his father was medically, he was in a hospital and he was unable to work, and that they used a phrase that normally was associated with somebody being terminally ill, but thankfully he lived another decade. And that's that story is then sort of like the impetus for that cello, the cello. And so, for those who don't know, there's a there's a single Del Gesu cello, as far as I'm aware, anyway. And this is it's from 1730. It has an original Filius label, but when you look at it, it has these like very vertical F holes, and then the wings just kind of like bend. There's that like awkward transition that you see in a lot of his instruments from that period. And the scroll is a Del Gesu scroll, and Filius was physically unable to build that instrument, and so and that was something that kind of was floated around as a Filius, but there were these internal records from the Hills or from Jacques Francais or from Wurlitzer's being like, I see a lot of Del Gesu here. but they just didn't think he built any cellos. But then when it became obvious that, or when it became known that he was unable to actually, that Felix was unable to build anything that year, then we recognized like, oh, this is a Del Gesu cello, and it's the one. But yeah, but for me, it's like I think the heart is the first one that really kind of like transitions into something different, and then we get the Chrysler, of course. Just a couple years later, which is, I think people have called it 30, and, you could also, say maybe it's more like a 33, but, to me, like those two fiddles kind of transition into something different.
Sorry. And then is there a time when you see, because he has really beautiful wood, Del Gesu, often, and is there a time when that starts? Like there's a moment where he's obviously acquired this really nice maple?
It's not like, to me, it's not as clear cut to me, like with Stradivari, where clearly something happens in like 1699. And like you start seeing, like there's a violin called the Reese, which is a gorgeous long pattern, when all of a sudden he's importing this like fancy maple from the north, and he stops using like the local opio that all of his predecessors in Cremona used. But certainly, by like, 30, 31, 32, 33, like he's starting to use things that look, pretty flashy. Like the Baltic, for example, that's a gorgeous one-piece back that is something that you would see on a Carlo Borgonzi violin from the same period, actually. So, was there...
And what date is that?
The Baltic is right around like 31.
31.
31, 32. So the Donkla also is an early example, which has a beautiful one-piece back. I'm curious, like, is there a connection between that supply of maple and the maple that Carlo Borgonzi was using to make his most beautiful instruments between, 33 and 38, roughly, Do
you think they're similar, the wood?
It's similar. I mean, it's also similar to like really beautiful one-piece backs that Alessandro Galliano used, hundreds of miles away in Naples. So I don't know if there's a connection or not.
And is it similar to Pietro of Venice's wood? I don't know if I read that somewhere, and then I was thinking, oh, maybe his brother could have bought some wood and sent him some wood, but yeah.
He could have. I mean, I think like their relationship and how it existed after their father became ill is fascinating to me. And, did they ever see each other? Did they communicate? Did they spend the summer with one another? I mean, like, who knows?
He did. I mean, he came back when the father died.
Yes.
For the will.
Mm-hmm.
He did come back for that. But that's the only one that they found the documentation of. But, they're not going to make a legal document if he just goes for a holiday, right? So... And then I was thinking after 1707, you've got the Austrians take control of Cremona. You've got all the Spanish are pushed out. And so that's got to do with that also affects trade. So their trade links with Spain will stop, and it opens up all of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's opening up to all the Austrian... and that's where you get the flood of cheap Austrian instruments because of the trade.
Got it.
So the geopolitics has maybe a role in it as well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at Peter of Venice's work, there is a period right at 1739 or 1740 when he uses, in my opinion, like by far and away his flashiest one-piece back maple instruments.
And does that come from Eastern? Where does that come from? Do we know where that wood comes from?
Normally that comes from north, like in the Baltic regions.
Yeah.
And that needs to be imported. So he would have had greater access to it probably in Venice than, being in Cremona. But in 1739-40, that's when you get the Baron Canute, which is kind of the trophy specimen Peter of Venice. That's in the Fondazione Pro Canale permanently. But you also get the Beatrice Harrison cello of like 39. And there's like a series of like 6 or 7 instruments that have this just like gorgeous one-piece back. And it's a flatter model, and it's like they're fantastic sounding. And but then the Beatrice Harrison, which was again one of Dave Fulton's cellos, the whole thing is made of that. Like the ribs are made of that, the back is made of that, and it's like the most glamorous cello I've ever been around, just bar none. But anyway, but then with Del Gesu, then you have these like really, I think you have these wonderful instruments like the Chrysler, and there are two Lafonts. There's a Lafont that's like from 36 that has like a two-piece Opio back that Nigel Kennedy played on, and it has a scroll by the maker, but what's not original. And then that's a great fiddle, but there's a 1733 Lafont that belongs to the Chimay Foundation, and that also to me, like, that's this transition, where he's getting out of this narrow-waisted pattern, and it's becoming more of what we recognize. And again, like the upper eyes become a little bit better. And that's a fiddle that if you have the nerdy violin books that we all have, like that's in the really nice 1730 to 1750 Cremona Expo. It's pictured in there. But again, like those upper wings, they like point straight up, almost in some of these fiddles, and the F setting is like very vertical. It's almost like a goalpost for American football or something like that. And then I've always been fascinated by like something happens in 1735 where like, once you get to like 34, 35, you start seeing like the absolute masterpieces.
Wait a second. Wait. He's born in
1698.
35. So he's almost at his midlife crisis.
Well, yeah, he didn't know, but he was actually at his like 3/4 midlife crisis because he only lived to be 46. But unfortunately,
maybe he was questioning his mortality and what he was making, and so he's gone in a different direction.
Well, yeah, I mean, aside from Stradivari, I mean, most of his friends and people he knew, yeah, they didn't live as long. But it's funny, there's like this dichotomy of instruments that happens in the middle of the 1730s, and so you have like you have the Diable, and you have the Plowden, and you have the Degville. You have the King, which is the one in Zagreb, which I've never seen, but I've never heard a bad thing. I've heard it as just exemplary in every way. I haven't seen it since I guess I was technically in the same room with it at the Guarneri exhibit at the Met in 1994, but
didn't get to touch it.
Yeah, but I would love to spend some time with that fiddle. I've heard great things about it, and I have wonderful pictures. But then there's these other types of violins that are like super tiny during the same period. So then he makes this like smaller pattern too. So there's like the Mary Portman and the Sennhauser. There is like the Huberman and like the Russian state instrument. And these are all like these are really tiny. These are almost like 7/8. And there's a lot. And then you start seeing these slab cut backs too, right around then. And there's not a lot of them, for Del Gesu, but there's like a successive run of them in like this around 35. And so again, it's like it's the Sennhauser, the Russian state, things like that. And so I've always been curious, like what was going through his mind, where it's like he's making like two very different types of violins
at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, basically within 24 months.
Okay.
And like I said, it's like the Diable and the King and the Plowden. I mean, these are on the Hill 9 list, right? I mean, if we really had to pick the 9, the Diable, the King, and the Plowden are all there, of the 9 greatest Del Gesus according to the Hills.
Why didn't they do 10? Why did they do 9? That's so annoying.
It is odd, isn't it? It's like, I don't know. Is it just the English? Is it the British?
Let's annoy everyone and do 9 and not 10.
Because it's like, it wouldn't have killed them to put yeah. It's like, well, why? Yeah, and it's like, what could you didn't want to put the Vieuxtemps on there, like to make it 10? Like, would anybody object to that?
Could you talk to me about Opio wood, because you've mentioned it a few times? Could you just explain?
So to me, Opio wood is the maple that is indigenous to the Lombardy region where they all lived and made. And so looking at, and it's a narrower curl, like when you're looking at the back. So the horizontal lines are narrower, in other words. and you see it increasingly, especially with the Cremonese makers of the 17th century. You see it on Andrea Guarneri's, and you see it on Ruggeri's, and you see it on early Strads, and you see it on Amati's, aside from maybe like some of the really glamorous slab cut grand patterns that Niccolo made in the 50s. But that's what was available. It seems like it wasn't until, and this is true today too. Like you can sometimes judge a maker's success by like the quality of their materials, or any craftsman for that matter, not just the violin trade. It wasn't until Stradivari, with his incredible success throughout the 1680s and the 1690s, that he then was able to import this more expensive maple from the north. And so the north, we believe, is like, the Baltic region. It's almost like Croatia area. And you see this transition, like there are some 1699 fiddles. Like if you look at Gil Shaham's Strad, the Princess Polignac, that has a twin to it called the Reese. And they both have this back. And you see these the early 18th century fiddles like 01, 02, 03, like the Lady Harmsworth and the Irish and things like that. And they have this back, and this wood it wasn't there. And it had to come from somewhere else. And it seems like because he was so wildly successful and wealthy, he had the means to bring in the finer materials.
And maybe with all the wars, the trade was disrupted as well, and it was easier to get locally sourced timber. Christopher Reuning.
Okay. And I actually put a last sort of period for Filius Andrea, and that was from after his medical condition, 1730 to 1740. And that was just his production of scrolls for his son.
That's right. I'm quite sure that, well, we don't know. I do know a couple of very old man violins without labels that were all his work. And who knows if those were made in 25 or 23 or 32 or, who knows? I mean, we just don't know. Not a single label in there.
Yeah, and I find it's hard to talk about Filius Andrea without talking about Del Gesu, because they really are intertwined. It's not this linear thing. They're they do sort of dip in each out of the work. And okay, that's really interesting.
But I think it's interesting to pay attention to something else that happened right around 29 and 30, 1729, 1730. This was a pivotal time in Cremona because in 29, Filius went in the hospital for whatever reason. You don't go in the hospital unless it's really serious in those days. And it apparently never made any more instruments after that. He made scrolls. That's the time that Giovanni Battista Stradivari died. He was the third son who was the heir to Stradivari. And when he died, Strad wrote his last will and testament, 7 different versions of it, and apparently came out of some semi-retirement. So those are 3 huge pivotal events in the violin making world, in a very short time span. And if you look at what happened to Del Gesu and to Bergonzi, they both went from being probably some kind of part-time violin maker to very productive violin makers who also transform their models significantly. And they transform their models in the same direction. They started to make the closest they ever came to a Stradivari. that's when Del Gesu started making the violins that look like the Chrysler, which is the most Stradivari of all. That group of instruments, the heart of the Chrysler, there's a group of those violins that all look like Strads. They all were made around 29, 30, 31, that period of time. And same thing with Bergonzi. He started becoming a very productive violin maker. Instead of making very few instruments a year, he started being a very productive maker, and he changed his model to a really close to Strad.
Right.
So why did that happen? Maybe they saw there was a opportunity. The young heir dies from Stradivari, and the only people left are three very old men in Stradivari's shop. Maybe Del Gesu and Bergonzi both thought there was a business opportunity to become serious full-time violin makers.
The city of Cremona had about 20,000 citizens. Where did Carlo Emanuel think he was going to lodge his 12,000 troops? There were only so many resources to go round. Del Gesu's father even now is telling his son stories of the invasion of Cremona in his younger years, when he, the younger Giuseppe, was a small boy and the streets were filled with badly behaved French soldiers. Inflation was ridiculous, and it was shameful, a neighbour piped in. On the way, the military had expelled the inhabitants of the monasteries to set up hospitals for their soldiers. Where were these good people supposed to go? The Austrians had treated them well, but these French and Piedmontese were incorrigible. For 3 years they would stay in Cremona. The winter months were the worst. The military campaigns would stop, and thousands of rowdy troops had to be entertained or they would wreak havoc in the town. Even now there were reports at the market of the countryside emptying because of the soldiers' incessant farm raiding. The prior of Sant Agostino would tell anyone who was willing to listen that over the years of occupation, 17,000 soldiers died in the monastery/hospital in Cremona. Troops on both sides of the conflict were committing countless acts of vandalism in the countryside surrounding Cremona. And where does this leave our violin maker, you ask? Well, Del Gesu was 35 years old and the youngest violin maker in town, in fact. The formidable Stradivari and his elegant workshop may have been out of reach for many a young player, but the younger Guarneri was so much more approachable and affordable. There were hundreds of soldiers in town these days. They needed entertainment, and Del Gesu had never been so busy in his professional life than he was in these years in which the city was occupied. The years 1732 to 1736 were the most productive of his life. The older Giuseppe was helping out, making scrolls, but what of Del Gesu's wife, Caterina? She was able-bodied and had no children to look after. The couple lived in cramped accommodations with 5 other families. What would she have been doing all day? Cremona was in a militarily strategic position and an ideal spot for a war council or two. Staying in town were foreign aristocrats, and seeing as there was no local theatre, such a bore, well, they brought their own entertainment. Musicians arrived in Cremona with the army and lost no time in making friends with the local minstrels. Together they founded l'Accademia Musicale, a musical academy that performed and taught young musicians that were now more and more in demand with the influx of military troops. The majority of these musicians were violinists, and so, despite the ravages of war, the musical culture of Cremona, in fact, benefited from this trying period. Del Gesu was making violin after violin, and perhaps the speedy execution of some of his work can be understood in this context. Business was going well. Del Gesu's father was able to pay off some of his debts, and finally there was a functioning working relationship between father and son. John Dilworth talking about the production coming out of the Guarneri workshop in Cremona in these years.
And they were making them for a working clientele, for actual musicians. So they were driven by what the musicians wanted rather than what the Duke of Burgundy wanted, or to furnish his chateau. Yes, until Filius's death. It was 1738, wasn't it? There seemed to be one or two left that Del Gesu was able to use for a year or so after that. The very earliest Del Gesus have Del Gesu's own scroll on them. It's up to 1729, 30, yeah. And they're clearly the same work that reappears in 1739. 1740 to the end. It's the same style. The ones in between from 30 to 38 are exactly the same as Filius's earlier work. It was one thing he could do, maybe he just sat down and he could, and he'd been doing it all his life. He could cut out a scroll in 10 minutes, and that's what he did. And Del Gesu used them, and I think Del Gesu, frankly, wasn't interested in scrolls at all. The ones that he makes, they are so weird. Well, it's not even. This is my late in life controversial idea that really Del Gesu did not care. He was like his father. They were in poverty. They had problems, and he had a wife to support. He didn't have any children to help him. Children were an asset. They weren't necessarily a burden. Once you had children, they become your assistant at the age of 10 or something. You didn't have that. And he tried being an innkeeper for a bit, but it was the only thing he knew how to do. It was the only thing he could do. But he was basically not that bothered.
Finally, in 1735, the French put on their nice Italian leather boots and marched, or ambled, out of Cremona and left the city to the Austrians once again. Del Gesu had been doing so well in these last few years. He was almost sorry to see them go. But what happened when 1/3 of a city's population literally just walks away is this. Cheap real estate! Woo! There were free houses to rent now that all the French troops were gone, and he had done well for himself in these last few years. So, Caterina and Del Gesu moved into a new home, a small building all to themselves in the year 1736. The immense strain these soldiers had been putting on the resources of the city was now over, and yet it left a void as well. Now that the war was over and the carnival season was coming up, the people of Cremona were not just celebrating Easter that was soon to arrive. They were celebrating the fact that the army had left town and now they could breathe a sigh of relief and party. Maybe a bit too much, according to the notary diarist Calvi, who noted with disdain in a diary entry. The carnival season culminating in an excessive display during this bacchanalia. This excessive display of merriment by the common people was a bit too much for him. The French were gone and had turned over the city to the Austrians once again. Jonathan Marolle talking about this period where Del Gesu goes back and is working with his father.
In the 30s, there's a shift when you see that he's responsible for carving the scrolls. And you can see that on Del Gesu instruments, you can clearly recognize when the scroll is made by Giuseppe Filius Andrea. But the rest of the violin is made by Del Gesu, and that's where he started to design his model, his new model. And so you have beautiful instrument. I think the best to me instruments made in the 30s. I'm thinking of the Kemp 1738, for instance, which is absolutely wonderful instrument, stunning instrument. The Adam also in the same year. You have Le Violon du Diable in 34, the Joachim, the Plauden. So, many beautiful instruments with nice wood, nicely done actually. With a good work. Like the quality of the work is great. Is the outline, the purfling, the wood used, and the quality of the varnish. It's very beautiful. It's not as neat and precise as a beautiful Stradivari, of course, but it's clearly a maker capable of crafting beautiful instruments. So I would say this is the second period.
Joe Bein.
You have this highly prolific workshop. You have, as people I think know, all of these wonderful instruments in the middle of the 30s. Most of them have scrolls by his father. So, I mean, that's kind of like an acknowledged fact for the listeners, is that the early and late Del Gesu seem to have, they have his individual scrolls, whereas the middle period ones generally have scrolls that are made by Filius or made by his father. So you have this you have this very interesting thing in the middle of the 1730s where he's, alternating between making these like real masterpieces that are, still today considered some of those beautiful violins on earth. And he's making some of these smaller pattern instruments as well to try and mix it up. And then you get to this next period for me where it's like, 37, 38. For me, it's like, I think if you look at these three great makers in Cremona in the 1730s, and you have Carlo Bergonzi and Guarneri del Gesu, and of course, Antonio Stradivari. And, for me, and I think you see, they're all kind of on the same path. And I would consider like Del Gesu's and Bergonzi's to be very, to be more Stradivarian in their composition, 35, 36, 37. They're more symmetrical, they're more even, they seem to be following a certain, type of making and a certain style. And then, with Del Gesu, I think, the peak of that might be the Kemp, which has an original label for 1738. And the Joachim, of course, which is a violin that is red like a Ferrari, with as much original varnish on it as any Del Gesu, but is not one that really has made it to many exhibits or things like that. But it was at the Met in 1994. But I wonder if like the Kemp was like made at the beginning of 1738, because there's only one thing that happened in Cremona in December of 1737.
So what happened in 1737? Well, you'll have to wait for the next episode to find that one out, because we're still hanging around in the early 1730s here. So we're back in Cremona. It's the early 1730s, and our young Giuseppe Guarneri Del Gesu has returned home. He's back working alongside his father, something he probably would have preferred not to do, but well then here we are. And after years of drifting, trying his luck elsewhere, maybe even working in another workshop, he's back where it all began. Only now things are different. The instruments he's making don't quite look like his father's anymore. And there's a new feel, a new confidence, as if Del Gesu is finally starting to find his own voice. His father, Giuseppe Filius Andrea, is older now, unwell, carving scrolls in the corner while his son finishes off the instruments he can't complete. Together they're producing the last of the Filius Andrea violins. But it is clear the torch is being passed. And as this is going on, Cremona itself is in chaos. The War of the Polish Succession has spilled into Italy. Soldiers are marching through the streets. Taxes have tripled. It's a lot. But in the middle of all that noise, in this small dusty workshop, Del Gesu is quietly reinventing himself. This is where the story really starts to shift, where Del Gesu begins to step out of his father's shadow and into his own skin. As the 1730s unfold, we find Giuseppe Guarneri Del Gesu back where it all began, in the family workshop, side by side with the father he once tried to escape. Together they finished the last instruments of Filius Andrea, the old master, carving scrolls from his corner bench, while his son stamps his independence with a new label, a simple IHS, a sign that will one day make him immortal. Around them, Cremona trembles under the weight of soldiers' boots and the sting of new taxes. The war of the Polish succession has reached their doors, and yet amid the noise of marching armies and hammering hooves, people still need their violins. Don't they ever? These are the years of transition, of endings and beginnings, when the son's voice starts to rise above the father's. The label reads Del Gesu, and a new chapter in violin making is just beginning. Well, Del Gesu's chapter anyway. In our next episode, we'll step deeper into this golden period when Del Gesu's style grows bolder, freer, and becomes unmistakably his own, and let's admit it, a bit weird, even as the world around him unravels in war. I'd like to thank my lovely guests, Jonathan Marolle, Joe Bein, Christopher Reuning, and John Dilworth. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Violin Chronicles. Be sure to subscribe and sign up to Patreon if you haven't done so already. And now we're going to continue for the Patreons. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Violin Chronicles. Be sure to subscribe and sign up to Patreon if you haven't done so already. And now we're going to continue for the Patreons. In this Patreon bonus episode, we'll be having extra content from the interview I had with Joe Bein, and in the discussion I have with Antoine, we'll be looking at the mysterious back central pin amongst other characteristics to tick off your, police detective notepad when looking at instruments.